Les Ceann Corla, and I'm glad to speak for Labour to support this motion and to have the opportunity to discuss this important issue. And indeed, I've just come, as was Deputy Function, from our Children's Committee hearings, where we were hearing from a number of different witnesses about childcare, about issues facing workers in the early years sector, from representatives of SIP2 and SIP2's Big Start campaign, and indeed also about how changes in the funding structures under the National Childcare Scheme has had an impact on after-school services. And we were glad to hear from representatives from the Dublin 8 After School Alliance and Derlingford Community Childcare. But one thing, Minister, that all of the speakers had in common is that they all referred to childcare as being in a crisis situation. And all of them said that we are currently, through our lack of proper coherent vision for childcare, that we are currently failing parents, staff, providers and of course children too, and that we're failing because we're failing to provide an equal service to all children and failing to provide adequate levels of pay for those working, those who are professionals working in the sector, and indeed failing to provide security for the providers themselves. And of course, as others have said, we know that parents face enormous costs in terms of childcare. In Dublin Bay South, in my own constituency, very high rates of fees are the norm. Around €1,000 a month is the norm per child, and that is really, really difficult for parents, as anyone can appreciate. We heard speakers saying that currently the model of childcare is, or our Irish childcare policy has for far too long been characterised by creative ways of stretching inadequate funding further. We heard that there is a real danger that we will see, building on the piecemeal provision we currently have, what one speaker from SIP2 described as the financialisation of childcare. And it struck me that, Minister, that what we don't want to see is our childcare system becoming financialised, becoming commercialised in the same way that we've seen housing, for example, housing provision dominated by a number of big investors. There's a real risk that we see with childcare, where we have this reliance on private sector and on piecemeal provision, that it becomes then financialised to that extent. It stops being seen as a public service. And I think that's the real concern. And it's a concern where we have this system that's held together by subsidies to private providers, where parents can barely afford fees, and where we have such low rates of pay in the sector. We have the second highest OECD household childcare costs, couples spending an average of 24% of income, and single parents as much as 29% on childcare costs. And of course we know that this has an impact on women particularly, and we know that in Ireland we have, I think, the lowest rate of participation by mothers in the workforce within the EU. So, you know, we need, Minister, to move to a very different system of childcare in Ireland. And on Saturday I was pleased to launch with Labour Women a new childcare policy calling for equal early years, calling for a universal public childcare system based on three key measures, or three key criteria. Equality for children, to ensure that each child in Ireland is guaranteed a place in early years education and childcare. Secondly, affordability for families, again to move to a system where we would have an investment to ensure that parents will find creche and childcare affordable. And thirdly, fairness for professionals. And again, the Big Start campaign has made clear the need for early years educators to be paid a living wage. And we do very much welcome, Minister, initiatives clearly like the Joint Labour Committee, but there's simply not enough is being done. And I've received from SIP2 testimonials from early years educators. One who describes themselves as the single parent of 2 teenagers, saying the low pay in my job has left me wondering how much longer I can stay in this sector. They say, I am working for €10.20 per hour, 25 hours per week. I have just finished level 6 childcare and wondering now, why did I bother? Because rightly we've introduced better or higher levels of qualification requirements in the sector, but we haven't introduced proper levels of pay commensurate with those professional requirements. And we do need to change that. And that's an absolutely crucial change that is addressed in this motion and that we're addressing in our own policy. But at a broader level, Minister, we do need to move to what I've described elsewhere as a Dun O'Malley moment. Just as 55 years ago in 1966, Minister for Education Donna O'Malley introduced free secondary places for all children in Ireland. So too do we need to move to see early years education and childcare as a right of each child, that we need to move to a position where we can guarantee each child a place in early years education. And I looked again at that visionary speech by Minister O'Malley saying in 1966, we will be judged by future generations on what we did for the children of our time. We're going to be judged by not having sufficient provision for children in preschool, of preschool age, and indeed for school age children in terms of after school childcare and support as well. And I think, again, we're out of step. If we look elsewhere within the EU, we find that elsewhere we have a much bigger spend nationally. Sweden, France, Denmark and Finland all investing over 1% of GNI, which is, of course, the UNICEF target, the international target, in the early years sector. In Ireland, we're currently investing just 0.3% into the sector, placing us far behind the European average. And we'll be launching our Labour Alternative Budget tomorrow, Minister, which will look at this, addressing this complete discrepancy in spending, this very low rate of spending. What we are asking is that the run-up to this budget would see the government outline how they will use this opportunity to move Ireland towards a universal public childcare system with that European norm of spending. We're asking the government to replace the for-profit, market-driven piecemeal model that is currently characterising our system of childcare by one which is state-led and which is universal and which guarantees each child a place. We need a Donna O'Malley moment or indeed an NHS moment to ensure that we are moving to that model and moving away from the current level of provision. And Minister, just to add also in terms of some government innovations that have had unforeseen consequences, unfortunately. I know this obviously predates your time as Minister, but the National Childcare Scheme, which was introduced in 2019, again we had very powerful hearings today about that, chaired by Deputy Funchion, where we heard that some of the unforeseen consequences of that scheme have been a move to a work activation model from a child-centred model, a move away from enrolment to hourly rates as a funding basis, with a resultant really serious consequences for community childcare providers and indeed for children in their services. And there's a real concern that equality of access is being hampered in that way. And my colleague Senator Marie Sherlock has really led on this and indeed instigated the event outside Leinster House earlier. And I acknowledge, Minister, you met with the community childcare providers. I know that was very welcomed. And I think this is fixable, and certainly the providers who we spoke with at the Children's Committee this afternoon have asked all of us on the committee to ensure that it is fixed and that targeted interventions are reintroduced if necessary to ensure that children from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds are not impacted adversely by the changes brought about by the National Childcare Scheme. And as I say, they seem to have been somewhat unanticipated or unforeseen consequences of a change of funding model. And I know you've addressed this to some extent in your own speech, Minister, saying that the government is moving to a new funding model, but this is urgently required because we're hearing the community childcare providers saying it's simply not sustainable to continue with the current model. So, Minister, why we're supporting this motion is because we in Labour do believe in the need for a radical revision of childcare in Ireland, for a move to a state-led public universal system, and indeed to move towards that system also in other areas of care, because we believe there should be a continuum of care, as that NHS moment suggests, that we have a continuum of care and that we have supports in place for all of those who need it from cradle to grave. Very much.